a special report from KDKA TV News.
Good afternoon. The jury has now decided the fate of mass killer Richard Baumhammers, and that fate is, as you are going to see now, he has been sentenced to death for killing 5 people in a shooting rampage that took place last spring.
The jury who convicted Baumhammers yesterday in just 2 hours and 40 minutes today took a little over 3 hours to reach that death sentence for Richard Baumhammers. Let's go right now to the courthouse and Bob Allen, who is live there. Bob, what can you tell us about what you're hearing?
Harold Hayes is here right now, and we do have the information. Harold.
They just announced that they have sentenced Richard Baumhammers to death by lethal injection for all 5 defendants, or all 5 victims. They had to read the verdict for each of the 5 victims, and the verdict was 5 consecutive death penalties for Richard Baumhammers. And I'm trying to get hooked up here so that I can hear you if you have a question to me. I would be able to hear you now. At any rate, the verdict is death by lethal injection. There was absolutely no outburst in the courtroom. The Baumhammers family sat on the other side of the courtroom, and there was no real visible emotion from them. Many of the family members I sat next to, or sitting more closely to them, and they were visibly moved. No outward sign of emotion, but many tears shed. So once again, the jury finds that Richard Baumhammers should die death by lethal injection.
Harold, this was obviously a very emotional part of the trial yesterday when the families of the victims were able to go on, and Baumhammers' parents. The judge, as you told us at noon, told them that they were not to let the emotion play a part in their rendering. So it came down, allegedly, what they were supposed to do were the aggravating circumstances and the mitigating circumstances. Talk about that.
And the prosecutor said this morning when he gave his closing argument that their argument was that when you weigh aggravating or mitigating circumstances, you weigh the lives of the victims. And even though the defense talked about mental illness as having a great weight in this, that he didn't really have full control of his faculties, the prosecutor said what you have to weigh in this situation is the lives of the victims. The jury obviously weighed very heavily the lives of all 5 victims. And there was a lot of emotion yesterday when the Baumhammers family was on the stand, too, talking about their journey through the mental illness of their son since at least 1993. But once again, the jury came down on the side of giving Richard Baumhammers full responsibility for his actions, finding him guilty of first-degree murder the other day, and now today sentencing to death by lethal injection. We should also say there are 240 people on death row in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There are 5 women included in those on death row. The average years, though, it takes from death warrant to execution is 8.7 years. You have a Michael Lesko who's been on death row for nearly 20 years. They're basing that on the most recent death warrant. Sometimes after appeals, you have a death warrant signed again after you lose an appeal. But at least 8.7 years on average before you would actually have execution. This verdict obviously is automatically appealed to the appeals court, and it will be quite a while before it's finally resolved.
Harold, again regarding the emotion in this case, also at noon you touched on the fact that even though jurors are instructed not to let emotion play a part in their rendering of this decision, you brought up the point, how can you not have it enter into some of your decision making? You've sat in there and watched the jurors. Describe what they have looked like to you as they've gone through this process, and how they looked just moments ago as these 5 decisions were read.
Well, just a few minutes ago, just after 3 o'clock, when they walked into the courtroom, the seat I was sitting in was right next to the door where they walk in. And they were very, I don't know how to put it other than very solemn. There were not necessarily tears in their eyes, but they were very solemn as they walked into the courtroom. They've been through quite a bit themselves. The first jurors were picked, if this is the beginning of the 2nd week of testimony, some of the early jurors were picked 3 weeks ago and cooled their heels for a week before testimony began. It's been a long ordeal for them. But they were very solemn as this verdict was read. Juror number 4, the foreman, stood up, read all the verdicts for all of the victims, and it obviously has taken a toll on them. I'm sure they're going to be happy to get home to their families for Mother's Day.
I'm sure they will be. It was been obviously a very trying time for the jury, a very trying time for everybody involved in this case. Harold, once again, a little bit of the timeline that took place today, if you can. The closing arguments we thought were going to take place last night, but they took place this morning.
Took place this morning in part because defense attorney James Weimert said that he was physically not able to give his closing argument. I don't know if that played as much a role on the judge as the prospect that he may have had his tip staff ask the jurors, do you want to continue tonight or do you want to do it in the morning? And they just, the decision was made by the judge to do it in the morning. At 9:30 this morning, we heard a 15-minute closing argument from prosecutor Ed Borkowski, which is unusual for him. I've heard him go much longer than that. In the guilt phase, it took him a bit over an hour, almost an hour and a half, an hour and about 20 minutes in his closing argument in the guilt phase. The defense attorney, James Weimart, took about a half hour, 35 minutes. And then the judge's instruction to the jury really didn't take that long. And then the jury got the case at 11:07. And so it appears that it took them a bit longer today, about 3 hours and 20 minutes, because it was shortly after 2 when we hear from the judge that they have a verdict and they will announce the verdict shortly. 3 hours and 20 minutes to decide life or death. It took them 2 hours and 40 minutes to decide first-degree murder conviction, but again, they had a lot more paperwork and about more than a dozen other charges to consider.
What we should go over once again here for people who may be just tuning in, and that is, again, the jury in the Richard Baumhammers trial. The same jury that convicted him 2 days ago today rendered its decision that he should die by lethal injection. And part of the whole case involved in whether Richard Baumhammers was mentally sound when he killed these people, and if he was mentally sound, or perhaps if he was not, as the defense argued, if he was not mentally sound, then he should not be put to death. But as Harold just said, Harold, and once again, as you point out, they rejected that argument again, not only in convicting him, but also now in the decision to put him to death.
And the standard for whether you convict him of first-degree murder or not is quite high. The standard in this phase for life or death was not quite as high for the defense. They could still raise the issue, and one of their mitigating points was whether he could appreciate whether there was criminality in his action, whether he was under extreme mental duress. They were still factors for the jury to consider, but once again, the jury came down on the side of the prosecution and said that Richard Baumhammers should stand responsible for his actions.
And Harold, let us know what's going on in the courtroom now. You talked before about the appeals process that is automatic in this case. Can you go over that again for us, please?
Well, it's automatic that there will be an appeal in a capital case, and again, the average time between a death sentence and the execution is 8.7 years. That's what we get from the Department of Corrections, but that's really a kind of a low number because they are basing that on the most recent death warrant, if you will. Once you've gone through an appeals process, and sometimes people go through appeals processes for years, once you get an appeal, they sign a new death warrant, if you will. So they're basing it on the most recent death warrant. They're saying 8.7 years average between the time you're sentenced to death and the time there is an actual execution.
And again, you went over a lack of emotion, if you want to call it that, by the defendant, Richard Baumhammers, throughout the case. And again, as this death sentence was read, emotionless?
I haven't seen much change in expression from Richard Baumhammers from jury selection until today. He stood before the judge. The judge says the defendant still rise, standard. He has the jury foreman, juror number 4, stands up, reads the verdict, and Richard Baumhammers has basically the very same expression on his face, pretty much a blank expression at this stage when they say that he is to be sentenced to death by lethal injection as he did from the very beginning.
And now has Judge Jeffrey Manning formally sentenced him?
Well, they have to have the formalities of pre-sentence report, and very frankly, as soon as I could get out of the door and not get into a tussle with a sheriff's deputy, I ran out of the courtroom. Ralph Iannotti is still in the courtroom and will probably tell you exactly what's going on in the courtroom at this point. But Richard Baumhammers, as we understand, he has been taken back to what's called the bullpen. The jury is, from what we understand, still in there, and I think the judge, as is the usual practice, has some discussion with them if they have any questions about the process, wants to thank them for their service. I'm sure they're ready to get their bags and head home.
All right, thank you, Harold. Hang on, I know we'll be coming back to you in a little bit.
Especially, I'm sure that we'll be going back to him to get possible reaction from attorneys involved and other people that were inside the courtroom. But right now, let's bring Mary Barecki in. She can join us live on the phone now, and she has with her the minister to one of the victims, Gary Lee. He was the 22-year-old who was shot and killed at the C.S. Kim School of Karate in Center Township, Beaver County. Mary, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Jennifer. I'm here with Reverend Bernard Wallace. He is the minister at Church in the Round. Gary Lee belonged to this church. The Reverend knew him all his life, and I was here when he heard the verdict come in. He's going to talk to you now.
Yes.
Reverend, thanks for being with us. Your reaction to the verdict, to the decision today?
Well, we're extremely happy that it's over and that a verdict has been rendered. I think it's a fair verdict and one that merits the crime.
How have you been watching this case, and what have your feelings been as this has progressed?
Well, we've watched it from day one. Our feelings have been one of, well, we were just torn in feelings. But we were able to regroup along with the family and then put it behind us. And with the verdict, this really brings closer to the entire process.
What has it been like for you as far as dealing with this tragedy, and how do you and the family remember Gary Lee?
We remember Gary as a very aggressive, ambitious young fellow who we feel was snuffed out of many of the meaningful activities as he was just about ready to engage in those processes. That's our feelings about him, and much more than that. But just in a nutshell, the mother has been actively involved in ministry here, along with Gary, and the sister. We have we suffered vicariously with her and went through every stage of process that she's gone through.
Some doctors and Richard Baumhammer's parents themselves have been in court a few times during the progress of this trial, asking people for sympathy for their son, to take into consideration the fact that they feel that he is mentally ill. Are you able to feel any sympathy for Richard Baumhammers?
Oh yes, by all means. We're truly sorrowful for what's happening here. His mother and father must be torn. It's their son. But at the same time, you have victims, family members who likewise are torn. So it's a no-win situation. It's one of those things that has been left into the hands of the jury, and we do believe in the process of law. And of course, if that's what they say, that's what it is.
All right, Reverend Bernard Wallace, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your reaction and your feelings on this decision.
Well, we have, Gary Lee was one of 5 people who were shot and killed on that day back in April. And we're going to take a moment now to remind you of the other victims. The first shooting victim, 63-year-old Anita Gorton. She was a neighbor of Baumhammers, and she was shot to death, police say, because she was Jewish.
Baumhammers then shot and killed a 31-year-old, Anil Thakur. He was a native of India, and this was at the India Grocery in Scott Town Center. Baumhammers also then shot 26-year-old Sandeep Patel, who survived the shooting. He is paralyzed for life, and by the way, we do want to pass along that Sandeep Patel is expected to hold a news conference between 4 and 4:30, which we are efforting to bring to you live when that occurs, to get his reaction to what has happened today.
And then after leaving the India Grocery, Baumhammers then went to a Chinese restaurant in Robinson Township, that is where he shot and killed 27-year-old Thao Pham and 34-year-old Ji Yi Sun. And then Baumhammers, as we mentioned a moment ago, then shot and killed 22-year-old Gary Lee at the C.S. Kim School of Karate in Center Township in Beaver County. Just a moment ago, you just heard the minister of Gary Lee, Bernard Wallace, saying that he is satisfied with that verdict today. That verdict, again, was death by lethal injection.
We do have crews in various neighborhoods, various communities affected by the shooting rampage that Richard Baumhammers was convicted of committing. And we will be bringing you reports throughout the next few hours of reaction from many victims and victims' families and friends.
You know, before the jury rendered its decision on whether Baumhammers should live or die, we commissioned one of our KDKA TV news polls, and the jury apparently agreed with most of you. Most of you said that Richard Baumhammers did deserve to die. In that poll, which we took place yesterday, 60% of the people we called said that Baumhammers should be executed. 35% favor life in prison without parole. 5% are not sure. That is a poll, of course, and it was up to the jury. And the jury was the one that had to make the decision. It was the jury that listened through more than a week of testimony, through all of the evidence, through all of the victims' family statements yesterday and the closing arguments today to decide that, indeed, Richard Baumhammers should be put to death. He will now become the 241st person on death row here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
We've talked several times about the emotion involved in this case. Jurors had to, besides seeing all kinds of graphic evidence, they heard from emotionally charged witnesses and victims' families. Ralph Iannotti has a story now dealing with the victims and what they said during the victims' families and what they said during this trial. Ralph.
Well, we're going to hear that in just a moment. Once again, this is what took place back in that April day of April the 28th at 1:30. The shooting rampage started that day. Richard Baumhammers broke into his next-door neighbor's home on Elm Spring Road in the Virginia Manor section of Mount Lebanon. There he shot his neighbor, Anita Gordon, a Jewish woman, and then set the house on fire.
Now at 1:40 that afternoon, Baumhammers fired 6 shots at the Bethel Congregation Synagogue on Cochrane Road. He sprayed graffiti, anti-Semitic words on the building. Anita Gordon was a member of Bethel Synagogue.
Then at around 2 p.m., Baumhammers arrived at the India Grocers in Scott Township, where he shot and killed customer Anil Thakur. Then he shot Sandeep Patel, who was working behind the counter of the store, which his family owns. Patel survived this shooting, but now he is paralyzed.
And at 2:25 that afternoon, Baumhammers entered the Yafei Chinese restaurant in Robinson Town Center. He shot an employee, Thao Tony Pham of Castle Shannon, and Ji Yi Jerry Sun of Churchill. Sun, a native of China, was manager of that restaurant.
And then just before 3 o'clock, Baumhammers got in and out of his Jeep at a strip mall along Old Broadhead Road in Center Township in Beaver County. There, he shot and killed Gary Lee, a 22-year-old black man from Aliquippa. However, a quick-thinking woman in a pizza shop next door phoned police, and then they arrested Baumhammers in nearby Ambridge just a few minutes after that.
Let's go now to that report from Ralph Iannotti regarding families on both sides and what they felt about this entire case.
Unable to control his emotions, Dr. Andres Baumhammers broke down and told the jury, considering his son's fate, it would have been better if Richard had cancer because that, he explained, could be treated. The Mount Lebanon dentist said if he could take the place of any of the victims, he would. He explained once Richard wanted to see Dr. Jack Kevorkian to figure out the best way to commit suicide. He said Richard wanted to die because he felt he was being persecuted and harassed by the FBI and other government agents, and he talked of taking his life at least half a dozen times. In the weeks before last April's shooting spree, an emotional Dr. Baumhammers testified his son was afraid to take the garbage to the curb of their Mount Lebanon home because he thought government agents would shoot him. Later in the day, Mrs. Inez Baumhammers testified, reading entries from her diaries displayed on a big screen detailing a history of her son's mental problems. As far back as 1993, an entry read, Richard keeps saying he is being watched everywhere he goes. The CIA is contacting friends. Later that year, she wrote, Ricky does not want anyone to know he's suffering emotional problems. In 96, one entry said, the dam broke. All old feelings about the FBI following him are back. In 1999, an entry states, we may commit Rick, he is not taking medication, and he has a gun. She said, quote, I could not survive, my son's dying. Immediately, though, Judge Jeffrey Manning ordered the jury to disregard that statement. Under cross-examination from prosecutor Ed Borkowski, Mrs. Baumhammers read sections of her diaries where he repeatedly blamed his parents for his problems because he claimed they screwed him up as a child. Earlier in the day, there was testimony and tears from the families of Baumhammers' victims. Annette Gordon, the daughter of the first person killed by Baumhammers, Anita Gordon of Mount Lebanon, said her mother's death had left a hole in her heart. And outside the courtroom, a relative of another of Baumhammers' victims said she believed there was only one option for the convicted killer.
But when a person is sick, they need to be put to sleep. He's going to do it again.
This is Ralph Iannotti reporting, and let's go back now live to the courthouse where Bob Allen is standing by for a recap of what has happened. Bob, any movement there since we last talked with you?
Well, Jen, since you left us, a lot of people have come out of the courtroom, including Mr. and Mrs. Baumhammers. And as you can see, all the people standing around, there are a number of people with cameras standing around, and that's what they're doing right now is interviewing Anise Baumhammers and I would imagine her husband, although I can't see him from here. As you know, Richard Baumhammers was already taken away. Several jurors have since left the courtroom as well. We don't know if we were able to talk to them or not, but all the activity is down in about the middle of the hallway. That's where all the interviews, all the activity is going on, and people are coming out and they're going the other direction. They're not really coming here. So that's what's going on right now. As you know, death by lethal injection. We're getting lots and lots of reaction. We will have those reports on our 5 and 6 o'clock news, but right now we're in the interview process. We're hoping to get some live interviews, but as you can see, everyone's surrounded by cameras and they're getting the interviews, and folks are leaving and going their own separate way the other direction of the hall. So that's what's going on right now. We hope to have some interviews.
Bob, before you go here, you've been covering this trial along with Harold Hayes and Ralph Iannotti from its inception. What was the reaction of the observers with this decision today?
Well, you know what? As soon as the decision was announced, there was a crowd of people standing behind the cameras, and there was a little applause. Several people applauded, so it appears that a lot of people were in favor of this death by lethal injection. And I was surprised, but yeah, people were applauding.
All right, Bob Allen, thanks very much. I know he will be efforting to get as much more reaction as he can from people inside the courthouse. And as we mentioned, we do have crews stationed in various neighborhoods affected by this shooting rampage last April. We will be sure to bring all this to you starting on our news at 5 o'clock.
That does it for now. We'll be back with any other breaking news. Now we return to regular programming.
This has been a special report from KDKA TV News.
Light in a moment.
Still need a Mother's Day card? Dave's got a few that really hit home.
Thanks for sleeping with the president so Dad could get a card.
Tonight, the CBS mailbag and a visit from Dave's mom.
Singing and dancing, Jessica Simpson! Plus, Will and Grace's Megan Mullally and a 5-year-old opera singer. Next, Rosie.
Friday at 4, followed by Ken and Jennifer at 5.
Kaufman's one-day sale is Saturday with a preview day going on now. Save 25 to 50% store-wide. Don't miss our early bird special Saturday, 8 a.m. till noon. Look for savings on the latest styles for your family and home. Plus, take advantage of great Mother's Day gift specials throughout the store. Don't forget to check your paper for extra 15% off bonus coupons. Kaufman's one-day sale.
Yeah, we got the gifts.
Who loves fresh chicken? Who hates trimming all that fat off? Meet the chicken tank. Now you can clean and trim chicken from this hermetically sealed isolation tank.
Hey, Jenny, how about these chainmail gauntlets?
They provide great grip for serious trimming.
Why trim anything? My Purdue boneless, skinless chicken breasts are already trimmed by hand, so they're 99% fat-free.
Purdue boneless, skinless, hand trimmed so you don't have to.
Why trim? Just start cooking.
Will a lifeguard shortage shut down your pool at 5?
Stars in an all-new Dr. Quinn movie, The Heart Within, CBS Saturday.